All right. Not the drug class. Woohoo! This is just a public service announcement for people who might be intrigued by the idea of alcoholism. So if you happen to be some rapacious administrator who thinks no one should share material publicly without paying tuition, nothing to worry about here. It's all completely innocent public service announcements. That being said, if you do happen to want to sign up for the drug class, this is the kind of information you would be learning. So you'll notice here we've got a continuation of my alcoholism lecture. And here are four intriguing heavy drinkers. I realize I don't have any women represented, so I deserve a critique from there. We'll have to see if I can remedy that situation. But you'll notice we've got good old Truman Capote, the delightful Jack London, legendary Edgar Allan Poe, and Nobel Prize winner William Faulkner, many of whom may or may not have had reputations for consuming legendary amounts of alcohol. What's the deal with alcohol and the writer? I'm not sure exactly. We do have data from Claude Steele's lab and others, including one study from my student Joel Erblick showing that consumption of alcohol decreases attentional capacity in a way that might help you focus on a task like, writing. But again, I'm not recommending the home game, just a hypothesis. As you'll recall from the last lecture, we do have intriguing ways to screen for alcohol-related problems, particularly if you're not all caught up in diagnoses. So we talked about the tweak. There's also the CAGE, and all of them have these fun little acronyms about them. CAGE, I think, is cut down, annoyed, guilty, and eye-opener. But basically the bottom line is there's some hallmark symptoms that we can look for in an opportunity to make sense of how people drink and what might be a sign that they're drinking problematically. Here we do have some information related to notions of 12-step work and 12-step facilitation. Now I realize not everybody buys all of these constructs, and I'm happy to appeal to the data as far as 12-step work is concerned. It is apparently not the only way to get over an alcohol problem. We have data on that. I also have data suggesting that 12-step facilitation, the therapy that essentially encourages folks to join the 12-step fellowship, get connected with the community, identify a sponsor, and really just make friends within there. Those folks ended up in Project Match being the ones who had the most days abstinent at follow-up. So if you make abstinence your goal, what a surprise. You're going to be the group that is the most abstinent. There's some lore, shall we say, about the family dynamics of alcoholism, and I just want to talk about what is falsifiable, what is empirically supported, and what is not. There are two key ideas. One that's involving codependency. So the notion is no one can be a problematic drug user in a vacuum. I may question that assumption, and have had a couple of homeless clients over the years who pretty much were in a vacuum on their own. But on the way down, they may have had other folks who essentially buffered them from the negative consequences of their problems. And so folks who habitually seem to find other people to buffer their negative consequences may get this label codependent. Now, what are the purported symptoms? Over-involvement with the alcoholic, meaning I'm not going to focus on my own life. I'm going to find somebody who's a problem drinker and make them my little project. You'll be stunned to learn this is common among children of alcoholics, particularly women whose fathers were alcoholic. But those data have been criticized in curious ways. An obsessive attempts to control the alcoholic's behavior. I can assure you that trying to control somebody else's behavior is a fool's errand, and if that person happens to be misusing alcohol, odds are high you've got something better to do with your time. A strong reliance upon external sources of self-worth. Well, this gets a little slippery and difficult to disprove, but generally, if you're low on self-compassion, low on self-esteem measures, tend to accept yourself, but only conditionally, only if you do things that others approve of or achieve certain things, you might qualify for this. It's not particularly specific. In fact, some of the work from Albert Ellis's protege suggests that unconditional acceptance of self is relatively rare, so this would not be a particularly specific symptom if it were a diagnosis. And then an attempt to make personal sacrifices in an effort to improve the alcoholic's condition. Wow. So I gotta admit, I have had multiple clients who have spent tens of thousands of dollars for somebody else's alcoholism treatment. If you're in that predicament, particularly for a spouse, I can certainly understand the loyalty and wanting to make sure your children have a two-parent household, etc., but it might give you pause, and you might enjoy support from folks who are in the same situation. And so the Alateen groups tried to, work around this, just tried to offer support. I'm often apprehensive because folks seem to make it part of their identity in a strange way. Why bother defining yourself over somebody else's problems, Nevertheless, let's all cut ourselves a little slack if we've tried to help some folks who weren't ready to be helped. And there are definitely positives in the 12-step programs and in that whole process that I think we ought to be able to appreciate the nuances of, and just fun ideas to know. And then if you're going to be immersed in the treatment of alcohol problems, you really do have to know this model. All right, well, so what is up with 12-step facilitation? I'm not going to reiterate the 12 steps themselves, but definitely take a look at those. And the 12 traditions are also super intriguing. But what you'll notice is some recurring themes. Generally, the opportunity to make your life bigger than just your own little problems. Appreciate the fact that you are maybe not as grandly causal as you might have thought at one time. That's some fun sets of thoughts to have. So one key idea is the notion of acceptance, and we actually talked about this, and we'll talk about it more in the psychiatric meds. Acceptance is the idea that, hey, I've got some limitations. The first step in the 12 steps is I'm powerless over alcohol. The chance to say, you know what? I'm not made of iron. I am not omnipotent. And then folks who are unwilling to accept some of these ideas are often said to be either in denial or minimizing. Now, unfortunately, sometimes this can lead to some dichotomous thinking, and we'll talk about it when we do the depression section of the psychiatric meds, but let's just hold this idea lightly that we can accept ourselves as imperfect humans striving for a multifaceted life, but hardly free of making errors, and all other humans make errors too. This is buttressing the notion of surrender, which essentially means let's have a spiritual life or something to stand for. So obviously the spirituality part is where a lot of folks can balk. I alluded in a lecture to my client who had a higher power that was his radiator. And when I was on the West Coast, tons and tons of people had the higher power was the ocean. Just something that's clearly not you and clearly bigger than you. And then can I surrender? Well, it's a lot like acceptance. There's something that is more important to me than my little world, and that I'm going to give things up to that, with the notion that this might be the mechanism behind how I tolerate my own thoughts and no longer need to create an intoxication experience that is going to help me escape them. Seems a little abstract, I realize. Let's take a look at some of the key activities that are associated with either the 12 steps or the traditions, and then see how they relate to some other treatments we know, like behavioral activation. So key activities, literally almost every session of 12-step facilitation focuses on the key notion of getting active. So getting active means going to meetings, going to multiple meetings, finding a meeting where you eventually feel like you fit in, attending it regularly, participating in those meetings, being the person who makes the coffee or, arranges for things. Getting active also includes identifying 12-step peers. So you've got folks who also have committed to not using drugs or alcohol. Finding a sponsor, literally getting somebody to commit to having an important kind of relationship with you where because of some expertise they have, they'd be willing to offer you some guidance. And then having some folks to talk to, having some phone numbers, calling the 12-step hotline regularly. This is the kind of thing that obviously increases commitment to a sober lifestyle and helps you occupy your day with activities that are essentially incompatible with alcohol consumption. Now, when we talked about behavioral activation, and when we talk about it again, when we talk about depression, this is really just, hey, let's make sure I spend my time doing things that are consistent with my values. I don't mean to minimize the spiritual aspects of this, and if that is the mechanism, we maybe need to find better measures of it, but this is really cool. So what's another level? Well, how about speaking at meetings? There are certain speaker meetings where one or two people are often the key speakers at that time, and they go up and sort of tell their tale, explaining exactly what happened to them, what they learned, or focused on a couple of key steps and how they were instrumental in their recovery. This is really an opportunity to also make a public commitment, as we talked about in motivational interviewing. And, that stages of change model. What's going to get activity to really happen? Well, if I've suddenly told everybody, hey, I am an alcoholic, and by the way, I'm making this public commitment to no longer consume alcohol, that's a pretty impressive kind of public commitment and sets us up for this cognitive dissonance where I'm no longer going to be able to behave in that way without really challenging my beliefs, or I have to change my beliefs. What I love about this is it really boils down to an intriguing quotation that has been attributed to a whole lot of different people, but faith without works is dead. It's one thing to say, oh yeah, I'm making this commitment and I'm going to confess it to myself and an omnipotent deity who may or may not be invisible, but it's another thing to start walking the walk. And as we walk the walk, particularly if we take on the identity of someone who is in recovery, we start behaving in that way more and more often. And lo and behold, as the number of days without drinking add up, and particularly as we endure challenges without running to alcohol or a drug, this eventually becomes particularly informative and maybe even easier. So a few of the 12-step terms that I think, in a sense, can be translated into behaviorism terms, but really have a nice accessibility, if you will, a certain intuitive appeal that are part of 12-step, either traditions, pretty much the traditions. One is including enabling. So anybody who minimizes the negative consequences or facilitates the drinking of someone else is said to be enabling. So if the dean calls me on a Monday and I have my wife answer the phone and say, oh, Mitch has the flu, but really I'm all hungover, we would say she's enabling, and that would be a hallmark of codependency. As if that's going to happen in so many ways, but you guys know my wife. I do think of the behavioral expression of secondary gain. What does a person get by engaging in this behavior is certainly working on an intriguing set of contingencies and something to look at from that perspective as well. The expression people, places, and things, meaning who are the folks who've been paired with alcohol consumption or drug use, where are the places that have been paired with alcohol use or drug use, and what are the things, what were the accoutrements, if you will. This is a lot like the cue reactivity work when we talked about with the opiates, where folks would shoot up with water or essentially expose themselves to the cues for the drug in an effort to extinguish some of those classically conditioned responses. But truth be told, this is not something you want to do on your own. And I've told a number of stories where folks kind of inadvertently find themselves in these situations that tend to elicit craving. But if you can identify these and make a relapse prevention plan for running into somebody who used to be one of your drinking buddies, or eventually ending up near a bar that used to be your hangout, that sort of stuff, it's, from a cognitive level, a great plan. And if you can expose yourself to the idea time and again, and even the spaces under safe circumstances, some of those classically conditioned responses are bound to die down. And then the HALT expression, which is literally hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. In a sense, these are internal states that have often predicted alcohol consumption in the past. Why not take advantage of that knowledge and either think about this from a cue reactivity perspective, or as signs that it's time to, reach out to 12-step buddies, your sponsor, pray, whatever, coping technique you want. I like this because, in a sense, it's saying, let's go ahead and attend to our internal state, our own affect, etc., whereas people, places, and things is often a kind of external, outside your own body approach. HALT is really saying, hey, we need to learn to attend to our own inner experience and have that be whatever it's going to be. It may not always be pleasant, but it's certainly something I could tolerate and maybe even savor if I let myself. So now, if I can have a range of affect, whether it be delighted or depressed, can I do that without drinking? And under those circumstances, take care of myself by intervening when I'm hungry, angry, lonely, or tired in a way that doesn't involve drug use, so I don't end up at high risk for relapse. All right? Well, if you're hungry, eat something, as we learned in one of my favorite comedy movies. If you're angry, can you work something out? Is there a way to make an assertive request? Are you lonesome? By all means, request some support. If you're tired, sleep. And it's stunning the number of cognitions we have around each of these. Oh my God, I'm not allowed to eat because, no, everybody needs to eat. Oh my God, I'm not allowed to get angry because, trust me, plenty of things can make you justifiably angry. It doesn't mean you have to behave in a hostile or aggressive way. It just means it's time to intervene. What about being lonesome? Well, we have individual differences on this, but hey, if you haven't been around folks, or if you're around folks and just don't feel connected, by all means, let's talk about building some social skills and making that feeling not only something you can tolerate, but something you can intervene with. And finally, tired. This American butch presentation of, oh, I only need 5 hours of sleep, that's a biological phenomenon. And you guys have heard me perseverate on the love, the heaven of sleep before, so I'll leave that at that. Bottom line is, so if you'll know these terms for a test, if you happen to be taking a test in a class that may or may not be presented related to this material, those are the definitions your professor might be going for. A curious other set of 12-step terms that I just think are intriguing include moral inventories. These are hard to describe without sounding judgmental, but they're really about taking a look at pretty much every behavior you've ever emitted, all your operants, and saying, what were my motivations here? Was this really about genuine contribution? Or was this some Machiavellian self-gain? And if so, what do I want to do about it? Building up to essentially one of the steps that's really all about repair. So if I make this inventory and realize, hey, there's some folks who I have wronged, I need to get in touch with them and offer to make amends. If I can do so in a way that sounds productive and isn't going to essentially create even more trouble, why not go ahead and do this? So I like this approach to all of life, and gotta admit, I have mailed a few checks in my day and made some apologetic calls, and we could all just take a look back at anybody we may have wronged and try to essentially reach out and offer to make amends. What a wonderful approach to life. Al-Anon, so if you happen to be related or associated with somebody with an alcohol-related problem, is it worth going ahead to connect to that community and talk to those folks and see if they can offer some support. And then the slogans, like, I realize these get minimized and ridiculed frequently, but the method behind the madness and the delight behind the message is actually pretty intriguing. So the first one is first things first. Essentially, if I make sobriety less than top priority, what's going to happen? Odds are high I'm going to increase my probability of at least a lapse, if not a relapse. And the other expression that I don't have on here, one drink, one drunk, this notion of controlled drinking is really counter to the disease model that's central to the 12-step model. So there isn't going to be a little lapse. Anything like that should be taken super seriously. Now, my friend Stanton Peele, who you guys have heard me talk about before, has ribbed this whole movement and talked about it as cultish, but I do want to focus on the positive on this, at least for now. Fake it till you make it is unfortunately one of the most misunderstood expressions, but what we're really saying is act as if you have faith. Faith will be granted to you, right? If I emit the operants, if I walk the walk, even if the chatter inside my head is not consistent, what could possibly go wrong, right? If I don't feel like getting out of bed and staying sober that day, and I do it anyway, wow, there's one time when I have challenged a serious set of cognitions, dealt with a serious set of negative emotions, and in some ways built up some self-control for when these events invariably happen again in the future. Easy does it, and I do have dose in parentheses here because that was one of the big jokes, at least among the relapsers, was easy dose it. But easy does it just means, hey, let's make sure, consistent with the first things first notion, we take our lives only so seriously. And we only demand reasonable amounts from ourselves each day. I think, coincidentally, if you happen to be dealing with a coronavirus and a national quarantine, it's kind of an American tradition to start setting outrageous, elaborate goals, when in fact, just getting through this time would be completely delightful and an admirable achievement. There's no need to have to learn a foreign language and master the ocarina at this time, right? So let's make sure our goals are reasonable and our expectations for ourselves include plenty of time devoted to self-care. And finally, turn it over. Whatever that higher power is, and folks who are atheists but, definitely relish and appreciate nature and the delights that are inherent in the universe, why not appreciate the fact that that is so huge and that my little problems could be turned over to it in a sense. Let me let the reverberations of the Big Bang handle some of this. Let me let the God I happen to love, who I'm praying to when I'm on my knees with my hands pressed together, handle that. And there's an opportunity here to then look upon my problems from more distance, treat my own cognitions with a little more flexibility, and then behave in ways so that my negative affect isn't a disaster that has to send me towards some kind of negative reinforcement model where I have to consume alcohol. All right, well, so we've discussed motivational interviewing, and it is my go-to approach to handling problematic alcohol consumption. The data are definitely supportive, and yet certainly not perfect. There are big gestures for trying to find some kind of biologically based treatment, and these include several medications that have the potential to function in various ways to make alcohol consumption either aversive or easier to resist or somehow less likely to happen. All right? So first and foremost, antabuse disulfiram. We talked about this before when we discussed the enzymes involved in alcohol metabolism. But basically what antabuse does is, if you're consuming it regularly and happen to have a lapse, the enzyme that's going to break acetaldehyde down isn't going to function as well, and you're going to end up turning all red and nauseated, and you'll be unlikely to continue the drinking experience. It will be particularly aversive. Supervised antabuse is one of our more effective treatments, although the level of supervision isn't what it once was. Some of those best data came out of the Soviet bloc countries, and of course they could be very persuasive. Nevertheless, if this works for you, by all means go for it. And a lot of folks take some real pleasure in knowing that that's there, so that even if they did have a lapse, it's not going to be a pleasant experience anyway. The naltrexone work has gotten a little controversial, but my friend Stephanie O'Malley at Yale, Stephanie Wem, who was a student in our program, a lot of folks have essentially shown that naltrexone has a lot of potential, and we talked about this in the opiate work. Naltrexone blocks that opiate receptor, which doesn't particularly sound like a lot of fun, and there's a subset of folks who use what they call the Sinclair method, who say, look, if you know you're going to drink, go ahead and take your naltrexone first, and you'll find you won't drink up the whole house. Truth be told, we've seen in the lab, Bob Swift's lab actually used the questionnaires that I developed to show that folks who have consumed naltrexone do not find alcohol consumption anywhere near as pleasant as they did before they took naltrexone, or they may have if they had consumed a placebo first. But the strategy so far has been, hey, you just got to take this every day and this is going to be your new life. Whereas the Sinclair method folks are saying, no, only take it if you know you're going to drink, and you'll actually wake up in the morning without a horrid hangover, and you won't have consumed all the alcohol in your town. I've seen some impressive case studies on it. The published literature is a little thin, but using naltrexone in addition to psychotherapy treatments like standard relapse prevention, cognitive behavior therapy, motivational interviewing, definitely does better than the folks who are in the same studies but who got the placebo group. Revex is basically just another drug that works in a comparable way. And then the acamprosate, you know what? Let's just focus on disulfiram if you happen to find yourself in a situation where you're asked questions about this on an exam. Acamprosate also seems to enhance treatment outcome when combined with psychotherapy, but on its own, just handed to you from a general practitioner, is probably not going to be a big help. Obviously, the ethics of taking one drug to help you with another drug has generated a ton of journal pages, but truth be told, anything that works, particularly if it doesn't have a lot of negative consequences, seems like a great idea to me. I should mention I have at least one paper published about folks who've used cannabis in an effort to decrease their alcohol consumption, and it is consistent with the harm reduction model. I know that mentioning it is a good way to get nailed to a cross on the cover of People magazine, but there definitely are folks who really swear by that, just as there are folks who swear by each of these medications. All right, the psychosocial treatments are numerous, but truth be told, the most popular ones are Alcoholics Anonymous and the ones that appeared in Project Match, the motivational interviewing, cognitive behavior therapy, and 12-step facilitation. So Alcoholics Anonymous and 12-step facilitation is literally, connecting to that fellowship and making it work so that you suddenly have a series of alternative behaviors, you connect to a higher power, you connect to that community, basically make a commitment to never drinking again and get to take advantage of that community and the process inherent in working through those 12 steps. Smart Recovery, Tom Horvich has done some of this work. Basically, if you can imagine taking some of Ellis's ideas, some of the standard cognitive interventions that we've seen work well for anxiety and depression, and seeing if we can, make a commitment to never drinking again. Unlike Alcoholics Anonymous, they have meetings regularly, but most folks seem to only go for about a year. And The data, obviously, we haven't had the randomized clinical trials we wish we had, but are also pretty impressive, especially for folks who just can't seem to get themselves to get motivated to go to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. Men for Sobriety and Women for Sobriety is a really delightful crew. Unfortunately, it's not as available or common as some of the 12-step groups, but they essentially have a whole subset of principles that are comparable to the 12 steps, but more about a cognitive mindset, so to speak, and I'll get into some of that later. Moderation Management was a crew that had attempted to offer social support for folks who were not necessarily going to go to abstinence, but still have some of the principles from cognitive behavior therapy to drink in a controlled way. The politics of that got a little hairy, and the person who started it ended up getting a DWI, and I don't see it as much. Secular Organization for Sobriety, SOS, as you can imagine, in an effort to kind of ride the wave of the new atheism, folks used translations, shall we say, of CBT and the 12 steps in an effort to offer social support to folks who wanted to decrease their drinking. I've got motivational interviewing here all in caps. Obviously, that's the one I like the best. But CBT, motivational interviewing, 12-step facilitation all create comparable outcomes and do, I gotta say, a pretty good job at decreasing the negative consequences of alcoholism, as we saw from some of the work in, well, really all our treatment outcome data. Nothing seems to work for everybody. If you find a treatment credible and something likely to make sense to you, what a surprise. It seems to do a whole lot better. And as I mentioned, I wanted to just list a couple of the ideas that are consistent with Women for Sobriety. They, I think, have a nice advantage in that because it is all women, you're obviously less likely to get hit on if you go to a meeting. You don't have to go there and wonder if someone's offering to be your friend for ulterior motives as much. And more than anything, just appreciate the community that is being around folks of your same gender, particularly if that's a priority for you. I just grabbed these three because I felt like I had something meaningful to say about them. So one of the adages, so to speak, is enthusiasm is my daily exercise. And it says, I treasure all moments of my new life. Obviously, this is aspirational, but if I wake up and review these kinds of ideas, particularly during that first hour after waking up, when some of us have our worst cognitions of the day, wouldn't this give me an opportunity to set an intention, make my focus be more on finding some valued activity rather than looking forward to a drink that day? I am a confident woman and have much to give life. This is what I am, and I shall know it always. Again, aspirational, and this is a big demand, and I can imagine some folks are listening to this and hearing their own minds squeal with the rebuttals, but let's go ahead and take advantage of the idea that we do have strengths we may be overlooking, and we have a great deal to offer ourselves, others, our environment. Why not focus on that in the beginning of the day? Wouldn't that provide some support for a life that's less likely to lead to problematic drinking? And I am responsible for myself and for my actions. I really like that part, but then the second part is I am in charge of my mind, my thoughts, and my life. Maybe, again, it's a confirmatory bias on my part. I am not in charge of my mind or my thoughts. All kinds of crazy things creep inside my noggin. Fortunately, I can believe them or not, depending upon how conscious I am and mindful I am at the time. So let's not make too much of whatever thoughts seem to worm our way into our heads. But I'm responsible for myself and my actions. By all means, let's take responsibility for what we really are responsible for and cut ourselves some slack for some things that were just situational contributors. Right? Everybody has a bad run once in a while. A whole lot of things contribute to the situations we find ourselves in. There's a lot to randomness. But when we talked about treatment in the past, we also talked about Alan Marlatt's idea of apparently irrelevant decisions. And apparently irrelevant decisions are little, small decisions that seem inconsequential at the time, but actually send us down a path that's going to make a lapse more likely. So I intend to exercise every day, but the night before I'm supposed to exercise, I end up staying up a little too late. And then I forget about a meeting I had scheduled that's Zoom with Thailand at 7 a.m. And then suddenly the time I had scheduled, right? You see how each of these things is connected, and a little dinky decision like, I'll stay up a little later watching Hulu turns into me breaking my commitment, me going back on a promise. Now, obviously, a little self-forgiveness is going to go a long way. Self-compassion is always going to go a long way. But let's appreciate how each of our little decisions potentially can lead to other decisions or other difficult situations that are going to make a lapse more likely. So part of being responsible for myself and my actions may include scheduling a day with the next day in mind. I'm not saying you got to have a future time perspective and need the complete 5-year plan, although I do think at this stage of life right now, a lot of us could benefit from it. But let's at least conduct this day with tomorrow in mind. Hey, I hope that's enough material for now. Obviously, if you happen to be enrolled in a class where this stuff is relevant, the exam is coming up. We're going to cover psychiatric meds in the abstract beforehand. If you do happen to have a question about any of these topics, whether you're enrolled in a relevant class or not, feel free to post them right here on YouTube or email me. Folks who don't have my Albany email are welcome to touch base through 420research@gmail.com. That's the numbers 420, the word research, and gmail.com. And I'm always happy to answer them. Love you guys. Wash your hands. Stay strong.